When the firefighters finally stepped back and the smoke began to clear, what Marcus Chen found in the ashes of his living room made his blood run cold, because there, standing in the middle of the destruction with soot covering his golden fur and blood dripping from his paws, was the family's 4-year-old golden retriever, and in that horrifying moment, Marcus didn't see a hero, he saw a monster. But what actually happened in that house while he was away would haunt him for the rest of his life, and this story, I promise you, is going to change the way you look at the animal sleeping at your feet right now. So let me take you back to the beginning, back to the morning when everything was still perfect and no one had any idea that by sunset, nothing would ever be the same. Marcus Chen wasn't just wealthy, he was the kind of wealthy where private jets felt like an inconvenience and where his name appeared on Forbes lists so often that he stopped paying attention, and he had built his empire from nothing, from a cramped apartment in Queens to a tech fortune that most people couldn't even comprehend. But here's the thing about building an empire, it takes everything from you, every minute, every thought, every ounce of energy, and somewhere along the way, Marcus had become more of a visitor in his own home than a father and husband. His wife Elena had made peace with it years ago, or at least that's what she told herself, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Sophie and 5-year-old Lucas, had grown up thinking that Daddy's job was simply to be somewhere else, and the only one who seemed to truly live in that massive Connecticut estate, the only one who was always present, always watching, always waiting, was a golden retriever named Biscuit. And I know what you're thinking. Biscuit is such a simple, almost silly name for a dog living in a $20 million mansion, but Sophie had named him when she was 4 years old because his fur reminded her of the warm biscuits her grandmother used to make, and somehow that name stuck, and somehow that name became the most important word in that household. Biscuit had been a gift, actually, a way for Marcus to apologize for missing Sophie's 4th birthday because of a merger that absolutely could not wait, and when Marcus had handed over that tiny golden puppy, he probably thought that would be enough, that a dog could fill the space he kept leaving empty, and in a way that Marcus never intended, that's exactly what happened. Biscuit became Sophie's protector, following her from room to room, sleeping at the foot of her bed, sitting beside her during thunderstorms when she was too scared to sleep, and when Lucas came along, Biscuit extended that same fierce, quiet loyalty to him too, as if the dog understood that these children needed someone who would never leave, someone who would always be there, and Biscuit was exactly that. Elena noticed it, she noticed everything, the way Biscuit would position himself between the kids and strangers, the way he would alert her with soft whines when Lucas had a fever in the middle of the night, the way he seemed to count the family members every evening like he was taking attendance, making sure everyone was safe and accounted for. But Marcus barely noticed the dog at all. He'd step over Biscuit in the hallway without a second glance. He'd forget to acknowledge the excited tail wags when he came home from his trips, and to Marcus, Biscuit was just another thing in the house, like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. That particular week in October, Marcus was in Singapore closing a deal that would add another few billion to his net worth, and he'd been gone for 6 days already with 3 more to go, and Elena had grown so used to managing everything alone that she didn't even feel lonely anymore. She just felt tired, the kind of bone-deep tired that comes from being a single parent while technically being married, and that Thursday night, after she'd finally gotten both kids to bed after Lucas had insisted on 3 stories instead of 2, Elena collapsed on the couch and closed her eyes for what she told herself would be just 5 minutes, but 5 minutes turned into an hour as exhaustion pulled her under. Biscuit, as always, was on patrol, making his rounds through the house like he did every night, checking on Sophie's room first, then Lucas's, then settling in the hallway between their doors where he could watch both at once, and it was almost 11:30 when Biscuit's nose twitched, when something in the air changed, something that made the fur on the back of his neck stand up, and if you've ever seen a dog sense danger before a human can, you know exactly what I'm talking about, that sudden alertness, that tension in every muscle, that ancient instinct kicking in. The fire had started in the garage, and investigators would later determine it was an electrical fault in one of Marcus's vintage cars, a frayed wire that sparked against leaked oil, and at first it was small, so small that the smoke detectors on the main floors couldn't pick it up, but smoke rises, and fire spreads, and by the time the first wisp of grey crept under the door that connected the garage to the house, Biscuit was already on his feet. He started with low growls, then louder barks, running to Elena on the couch and pawing at her frantically, but Elena was exhausted, and in her sleep-fogged mind, she pushed him away and mumbled for him to go lay down. And this is where I need you to understand something. Biscuit had never been a loud dog, he had never been one to bark without reason, and when Elena dismissed him, when she rolled over and ignored his warnings, something shifted in him. A desperation that pushed him past his training, past his gentle nature, past everything except the need to save his family. He did something he had never done before. He jumped onto the couch and started pulling at Elena's sleeve with his teeth, not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to tear the fabric, and when Elena shot up, ready to scold him, ready to demand what on earth had gotten into him, that's when she smelled it, that faint but unmistakable smell of smoke, and in one terrible second, her entire world tilted on its axis. Elena ran for the children's rooms, and Biscuit ran with her, but the hallway was already filling with a hazy grey mist that made her eyes water, and by the time she reached Lucas's room, she could hear the smoke detectors finally shrieking to life throughout the house, and Lucas was crying, confused and scared and calling for his mommy, and Elena grabbed him and ran to Sophie's room, but Sophie wasn't there. Sophie's bed was empty, and in that moment, Elena felt a terror so absolute that she couldn't breathe, she couldn't think, she could only scream her daughter's name into the thickening smoke. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Sophie had woken up earlier needing water and had wandered downstairs to the kitchen, and when the smoke started filling the house, she had gotten confused, disoriented, and instead of running toward the stairs, she had run away from them, deeper into the house, toward the back rooms that were closest to the garage, and Biscuit, somehow, knew this. Either he heard her crying or he tracked her scent through the smoke, but while Elena was screaming for her daughter and clutching Lucas against her chest, Biscuit disappeared into the grey. The fire was getting worse now, the sound of it a living thing, crackling and roaring and hungry, and Elena had to make an impossible choice. She had to get Lucas outside, she had to call for help, but every cell in her body was screaming to find Sophie, and she stood there frozen, paralyzed by a decision no mother should ever have to make, when a neighbor who had seen the smoke started pounding on the front door, and suddenly hands were pulling her and Lucas out into the cool night air, and suddenly there were sirens in the distance, and suddenly all Elena could do was collapse on the lawn and sob because her daughter was still inside. But here's what was happening inside that house, and I need you to really picture this because it's the part of the story that changes everything. Biscuit had found Sophie huddled in a corner of the back hallway, her little body shaking with sobs, too scared to move, the smoke so thick around her that she couldn't even see the dog approach until she felt his wet nose against her face, and Sophie, only 8 years old and terrified beyond words, wrapped her arms around his neck and held on. And that's when Biscuit did something that still makes me emotional to talk about. He started pulling her, guiding her, nudging her away from the fire and toward the front of the house, and when a burning piece of ceiling fell and blocked their path, Biscuit pushed Sophie against the wall and stood in front of her, taking the burning debris against his own body to shield her from the flames. The pain must have been unimaginable, but Biscuit didn't run, he didn't abandon her, he found another way, pushing through smoke so thick that his lungs must have been screaming, and when Sophie stumbled and fell, too weak from the smoke to stand, Biscuit did something that seemed impossible. He grabbed the back of her pajama shirt in his teeth and he dragged that little girl inch by inch through the burning house. His paws blistering against the hot floor, his eyes streaming, his body failing, but he didn't stop, he wouldn't stop, because those children were his purpose, his family, his whole reason for existing, and he would die before he let Sophie die alone in that fire. The firefighters found them just inside the front door, Sophie barely conscious and Biscuit collapsed beside her, both of them covered in soot and burns, and they rushed Sophie out to her mother, and the sound Elena made when she saw her daughter, that primal scream of relief and terror and gratitude, that's a sound that the firefighters said they would never forget. And then, for hours later, Marcus's plane landed, and he drove like a maniac from the airport to the hospital where his family had been taken, and when he arrived, his heart was in his throat, his mind racing through every worst-case scenario, and he found Elena with bandaged hands from where she'd burned herself trying to get back inside, he found Lucas shaken but unharmed, and he found Sophie covered in burns, an oxygen mask on her face, doctors saying she had severe smoke inhalation and would need weeks of recovery, and Marcus, the man who had missed so many moments because of business, the man who had let a dog fill the space he should have filled, that man finally broke, but not in the way you might expect. Because when Marcus demanded to know what happened, when he pieced together that the dog had been alone in the house with his children, when he saw the destruction, the torn furniture, the knocked-over tables, the scratch marks on the walls from Biscuit's frantic movements, when he saw his daughter's torn pajamas and heard that the dog had been found with his teeth in her shirt, something in Marcus's exhausted, guilty, terrified mind twisted the story into something it wasn't, and he looked at Biscuit, who had been brought to an emergency vet and was now lying in a cage with bandaged paws and burned fur, and Marcus felt rage, pure and misdirected rage, because it was easier to blame the dog than to blame himself for not being there. "Get rid of him," Marcus said, and his voice was cold in a way that made Elena step back, and when she tried to explain, when she tried to say that Biscuit had saved Sophie, Marcus wasn't listening. He was looking at the burns on his daughter's arms, he was looking at the tooth marks on her shirt, he was convinced that the dog had made everything worse, that the dog had attacked his daughter in the chaos. And no amount of Elena's protests could break through his guilt-fueled certainty. The next morning, while Sophie was still in the hospital, Marcus personally drove Biscuit to an animal shelter 40 miles away, and he didn't look back, he didn't say goodbye, he just filled out the paperwork and left, and Biscuit, still injured, still weak, still bearing the wounds of his sacrifice, watched through the cage as the only family he'd ever known walked away. And if dogs can feel heartbreak, if dogs can experience the pain of abandonment, then Biscuit felt it all in that moment. The days that followed were dark in ways that no one in the Chen family could have predicted, because Sophie woke up asking for Biscuit, crying for him, telling anyone who would listen that Biscuit saved her, that Biscuit was a good boy, that Biscuit pulled her through the fire, but Marcus dismissed it as confusion, as trauma, as a child's imagination filling in the blanks, and he told Sophie that Biscuit had gone to live on a farm, which is what parents always say when they don't want to tell the truth, and Sophie stopped talking after that. She just went quiet in a way that scared everyone, and the house felt emptier than it ever had, and even Marcus, in his most private moments, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was Elena who finally demanded to see the security footage, 3 weeks after the fire when the insurance investigators had finished their work and released the files, and Marcus sat beside her, prepared to see evidence of a dog going crazy in a crisis, prepared to justify the decision he had made, but what he saw on that screen, what played out in that grainy footage, destroyed every certainty he had ever held. He watched Biscuit bark at Elena, trying to wake her. He watched Biscuit run toward the smoke while any other creature would have run away. He watched Biscuit find Sophie and shield her from falling debris. He watched Biscuit drag his daughter through flames, enduring burns that should have made him collapse, never stopping, never letting go. And Marcus watched himself become the villain of his own story, and for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Chen, billionaire, titan of industry, a man who had never apologized for anything, put his head in his hands and sobbed. "What have I done?" he kept saying, over and over. "What have I done?" And Elena didn't comfort him because honestly, she was too angry, too hurt, too devastated that he hadn't listened, that he had thrown away the creature who had sacrificed everything for their daughter, and Marcus knew that no amount of money, no amount of success, could fix what he had broken. He drove to the shelter the next morning, terrified that Biscuit would already be gone, adopted or worse, and when he burst through the doors and demanded to see the golden retriever he had surrendered 3 weeks ago, the woman at the front desk gave him a look that made his stomach drop, and she said, "You mean the one with the burns? He's still here. Nobody wants a dog that looks like that." And Marcus ran to the back, his expensive shoes slipping on the concrete floors, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it. And when he reached that cage, when he saw Biscuit lying there with half his fur missing and his paws still bandaged and his eyes so tired, Marcus fell to his knees and pressed his forehead against the cage door, and he whispered, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, please forgive me, I didn't know, I didn't understand, please come home." And here's the thing about dogs, here's the thing that breaks me every single time. Biscuit looked at Marcus, the man who had ignored him for 4 years, the man who had thrown him away like garbage, and Biscuit's tail started to wag, just a little, just enough, because dogs don't hold grudges the way we do, dogs forgive in ways that humans will never deserve, and when Marcus opened that cage, Biscuit limped forward and pressed his injured body against the man who had wronged him, and that right there, is a kind of grace that I think we're all still trying to understand. Sophie's reaction when she saw Biscuit again is something the family still talks about, the way she screamed his name and threw her arms around his neck and refused to let go for almost an hour, the way Biscuit somehow found the strength to wag his whole body despite his injuries, the way the two of them fell asleep together on Sophie's bed that night, and Marcus stood in the doorway watching, knowing that he would spend the rest of his life trying to earn what that dog had given freely. Today, Biscuit's fur has grown back, though you can still see the scars if you know where to look, and Marcus works from home now. He stepped back from most of his responsibilities because he realized that no business deal would ever be worth missing another moment with his family, and every night when he watches Biscuit do his rounds, checking on Sophie, checking on Lucas, counting the family to make sure everyone is safe, Marcus understands something that took him far too long to learn, that heroism doesn't always roar, sometimes it limps, sometimes it has 4 legs and a simple name, and sometimes the ones who love us most fiercely are the ones we notice the least. So I have to ask you something, and I really want you to think about it before you answer. Do you think Biscuit should have forgiven Marcus, or did Marcus not deserve a second chance? Let me know in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you would have done if you were in that situation, and if this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of a dog in your life who never gets enough credit. Please share this video with someone who believes that dogs are family, because stories like this deserve to be told, and Biscuit, wherever he is right now, probably curled up at Sophie's feet, deserves to have the world know that he is, without question, the best boy.